Pennywise wasn't always a name whispered in the shadows. Long before he became the monstrous clown that haunted the children of Derry, there was something much more ancient, something far more terrifying. To understand Pennywise, you must first understand the deep, unexplainable fear that gave birth to him. Long before humans walked the earth, before Derry was even founded, something lurked beneath the surface of the world. This entity, this force, had no name, no form. It fed on fear, devouring every trace of light and hope. It was born from the darkest corners of human imagination, where nightmares are spun and fears are magnified. Could take any shape, adopt any form. It was the thing that slithered in the dark, the thing that lurked in the closets of children. And it was hungry. But when the first settlers arrived in Derry, something changed. The land was alive with a strange energy, an energy that fed the darkness beneath. It drew the creature to this small, isolated town, where the minds of the people were fresh and full of new fears. Here it would take its most memorable and haunting form. The clown. A symbol of joy, innocence, and humor. Twisted into something unrecognizable. Pennywise was born from this warped version of innocence. He was no longer just a shadow in the corner of a child's room. He became a living nightmare, capable of manifesting every child's darkest fear. But Pennywise didn't stop there. No. He wanted more. He wanted to break them from the inside out, to make them understand the true meaning of terror. And so, Pennywise danced. The idea of a clown, someone who made people laugh, was the perfect cover. It would lull people into a false sense of safety. After all, who would fear a clown? Who would suspect that something as innocent as a painted face and floppy shoes could bring death and ruin? But as Pennywise danced through the streets of Derry, as he took the form of every child's worst fear, he slowly learned the most terrifying lesson of all. Fear could be controlled, twisted, manipulated. Pennywise was not merely a creature of nightmare. He was a master of fear itself. And he wasn't content with simply scaring children. It wasn't enough for Pennywise to simply haunt the town. No, Pennywise craved the feeling of control, the satisfaction of watching his victims squirm in his grasp. He knew that fear wasn't just about creating horror in the moment. True fear was the slow burn, the kind that lingered in your mind long after the terror had faded. This is where his dance began. His twisted game of cat and mouse. The townspeople, particularly the children, were no more than pawns in his intricate nightmare. Pennywise would appear when least expected, sometimes in the most innocent of forms. A balloon drifting down the street. A flicker of light in a basement window. A shadow on the wall that danced like the flicker of a fire. He would stand just outside their line of vision, letting them catch only glimpses of his pale face and glowing yellow eyes. The anticipation built, each interaction escalating, until they were consumed by the anxiety of the unknown. When they least expected it, he would strike. But it was never a quick strike. Pennywise would make them wait, draw out the fear, the panic, the hopelessness, until their minds were so twisted by terror that they couldn't distinguish reality from nightmare. And what was more terrifying than this? Pennywise wasn't simply preying on physical fear. No, he was after something far deeper. He understood the human mind better than anyone. He knew how to take the smallest seed of doubt, of insecurity, and turn it into a full-blown nightmare. He would exploit every fear a person had, whether it was the fear of losing loved ones, the fear of being alone, or the fear of never being good enough. Every time a child or an adult came into contact with Pennywise, he would plant that seed. And as they grew older, that seed would twist and grow, eventually blossoming into the most horrific version of their fear. He had no need for weapons. He had no need for violence. All he needed was their fear, their deepest insecurities. And then, when they were broken, he would dance. As Pennywise grew more powerful, his mind games became more sophisticated. He learned to manipulate the very fabric of reality, warping the minds of his victims. They would see things that weren't there, terrifying things that felt more real than the ground beneath their feet. They would hear whispers in the dark, the faintest sound of children's laughter echoing through the empty streets. But Pennywise's greatest weapon wasn't his terrifying shape-shifting abilities or his knack for appearing at the most inopportune times. No, his greatest weapon was his ability to make people doubt themselves, to make them question their own sanity. In a town like Derry, with its long history of tragedies and disappearances, the line between what was real and what was a figment of their imagination became blurred. The people of Derry had lived in fear for so long that they no longer knew if the terror they felt was coming from an external source, or if they were simply haunted by their own minds. It was this psychological tension that allowed Pennywise to thrive. He wasn't just a killer. He was a puppeteer, pulling the strings of the townspeople's fears, making them dance to his will. As the years passed, Pennywise's influence grew. He was no longer just an entity that appeared when fear was at its peak. No, he was a part of Derry's very fabric. Every dark alley, every abandoned building, every street corner seemed to carry his presence. His influence was in the air, in the ground beneath their feet, in every whisper of wind. And yet, despite his omnipresence, Pennywise was always just out of reach. He was a shadow, never fully seen, never fully understood. But his grip on Derry was undeniable. As the years went on, fewer and fewer people remembered what life had been like before Pennywise. As Pennywise's grip on Derry tightened, the town's once lively and bustling atmosphere began to shift. The smiles faded, the laughter grew less frequent, and the children started to disappear. It was only a matter of time before those who dared to stand against him began to unravel. They couldn't fight what they couldn't see. They couldn't fight something that seemed to exist everywhere, haunting them at every moment. And so, the cycle continued. Pennywise's victims would grow up, but the fear never left them. The memories of their encounters would fade into the recesses of their minds, but Pennywise was always there, lurking, waiting. The few who survived their first encounter with Pennywise, those who managed to resist the madness, to escape his twisted grip, were marked forever. The psychological scars they carried shaped their every thought, their every action. It wasn't just the physical fear of Pennywise that haunted them. It was the unshakable feeling that something was always watching, always waiting, just around the corner. And now, after decades of silence, Pennywise is back. He's not the same as he once was. More twisted, more powerful, and more dangerous than ever. But one thing remains unchanged: his hunger for fear. He still dances through the streets of Derry, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the people of Derry, they're not safe. Not now. Not ever. Because Pennywise's true power isn't in his form or his abilities. It's in the fear he inspires. And as long as the people of Derry are afraid, Pennywise will always return. So ask yourself this: what are you afraid of? And how long will it take for Pennywise to find it and dance with you? The fog had returned. Thick, suffocating, and clinging to the edges of every street, it was as if Derry itself was holding its breath. Pennywise had been dormant for decades, slipping into the shadows, feeding off the fear left behind by generations who had long forgotten the true extent of the terror he had once caused. But terror never truly dies. It simply waits for the right moment to rise again. And that moment was now. The children of Derry had grown up. They had moved away, left the town, and many had convinced themselves that Pennywise was nothing more than an old legend, a nightmare from their youth. But the fear, those deep, primal threads of fear, had never truly left them. It was buried, locked away in their minds, but still pulsing like an infected wound, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. For those who remained, the quiet dread had returned to the town. The atmosphere had changed, as though Derry itself was bracing for something to shatter the stillness. The sound of distant footsteps in the fog became more frequent. The streetlights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows. The abandoned houses seemed to lean closer, their windows hollow, like dark eyes waiting for a glimpse of something or someone. But it wasn't the town that was changing. It was the people. One by one they started to remember. The old fears, the whispers in the dark corners of their minds, all came rushing back. The visions of a clown with glowing eyes. The smell of stale popcorn and decaying balloons. The laugh. The voice that could curl your spine, freeze your blood. They remembered the evil in the form of a painted smile. And with that, came the suffocating realization that Pennywise had never left. He had been lying in wait, growing more powerful in the silence, feeding on their collective unease. Started with the children again. The cycle was about to begin anew. A child disappeared. Then another. And another. But this time something was different. Pennywise wasn't just feeding on the fear of the innocent. He was testing something darker, something more insidious. He was preparing to rip open the veil that separated the living from the dead, to drag Derry into his world. A world where fear was no longer just a fleeting sensation, but the very air you breathed. The survivors, those few who had once dared to stand against Pennywise, returned to Derry, each carrying the heavy weight of their childhood nightmares. They had tried to forget, tried to live normal lives, but the memories of Pennywise, the terror he had unleashed, had always lingered in their hearts. Their connection to Derry was undeniable. The fear that had bound them as children was now a ghost that pulled them back. And as they arrived, the town felt as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. They gathered in secret. Their faces were no longer those of children, but the darkness of the past had left its marks on them. Some were broken, some were determined, but all of them were terrified. Pennywise had once been defeated, or so they had thought. But fear had a way of coming back, and so had he. The air was thick with dread as they ventured into the heart of Derry. The town had changed, but the feeling of something watching them, something waiting, was the same. The darkness seemed to pulse with life, and the streets felt too narrow, too quiet. Their memories flooded back, those long-forgotten nights when Pennywise had danced. His eyes gleaming, his smile widening as he twisted their fears into something monstrous. As they walked deeper into Derry, they could feel it. His presence like a cold wind crawling beneath their skin. The whispers of children's laughter echoed from the shadows. A balloon floated by, moving with the eerie wind. And then they saw him. Pennywise. Not the clown they remembered, but something older, more monstrous. His body was stretched and twisted, his form shifting with every passing second. His smile was grotesque, distorted, and his eyes burned with an intensity that sent shivers down their spines. "You've come back," Pennywise said, his voice dripping with malice. "How?" Nostalgic. And just like that, the dance began again. The children, the victims, the fear. It all spiraled back to the beginning. Pennywise was no longer just a creature of terror. He had become something far worse. A living manifestation of Derry's suffering, a reflection of every dark secret buried within the town. It was then that they understood, the truth they had all denied for so long. Pennywise wasn't just a clown. He wasn't merely an entity that fed on fear. Pennywise was Derry itself. He was the town's history, its trauma, its deepest fears brought to life. The pain of every lost soul, every broken family, every child that had vanished over the years. It had all been feeding him, making him stronger. Derry had been a fertile ground for fear, and Pennywise had grown with it. The town itself was the perfect incubator for his power. As they faced him, trapped within the heart of Derry's decay, they realized they couldn't destroy him the way they had before. This time they weren't fighting a creature. They were fighting the embodiment of a town's sins, its forgotten history, and its unresolved pain. To defeat Pennywise, they had to face something far deeper than just fear. They had to face the truth. Each one of them was forced to confront their own darkest memories, the regrets, the guilt, the moments of weakness that had shaped their lives. And as they did, Pennywise fed off their emotions, twisting their thoughts, trying to break them once more. But something shifted. In that moment, they realized that fear could only have power if they let it control them. It wasn't about defeating Pennywise with brute force. It was about confronting the fear within themselves. As they stood together, acknowledging their fears and letting go of the power they had given him, Pennywise began to lose his grip. His form flickered and trembled, unable to maintain its hold on them. The climax of their battle wasn't a fight of physical strength, but a war of wills. Pennywise, realizing that he had no more hold over them, began to unravel. His monstrous form grew unstable, his laughter turning into a screech of rage. His eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, flickered with fury. "Fear me," Pennywise roared. "I am the king of nightmares. You cannot escape me." But it was too late. The survivors, united in their acceptance of their own fears, stood firm against the darkness. They no longer saw him as the clown. They saw him for what he truly was, a manifestation of terror. And they had taken away his power by confronting their own. With a final scream, Pennywise began to collapse in on himself, his body dissolving into a mass of shadows and screams. The air around Derry grew still, the fog lifting for the first time in decades. The nightmare that had haunted the town for so long was fading. But even as the fog cleared, one thing remained: the fear. For fear is never truly gone. It only sleeps, waiting for the next time it can rise again. And though Pennywise was defeated, the people of Derry knew one thing: terror is a cycle, and it would always return. It might wear a different face, take a different shape, but it would always return. Because fear, true fear, never dies. Simply waits. As the survivors left Derry, the town stood silent, a place scarred by its own history, with its wounds never truly healed. They knew that one day, fear would come again, perhaps not in the form of Pennywise, but something just as terrifying. And when it did, the people of Derry would be forced to remember the dance of death, the terror that had once twisted their lives. But until that day came, the fog had lifted. For now the town was free. For a while. And as for Pennywise, well, even monsters can dance their last dance, but their shadows are never far behind.